The dining room glowed with that curated kind of elegance I'd never quite gotten used to. White marble tiles, high-backed velvet chairs that looked like they belonged in a museum, and a chandelier so large it seemed to hang from heaven itself. The table was set for 16, though I counted just a dozen guests, all dressed in muted designer tones, murmuring their compliments and sipping wine with the kind of restraint that felt rehearsed. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, was wearing an ivory silk dress that shimmered under the lights, her makeup flawless, her blonde hair swept into a sleek bun that made her look every inch the magazine perfect hostess. She gave me a quick smile, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes, and gestured for me to take my seat. I'd flown in that afternoon, carefully wrapping the gift I chose for Andrew. It was a first edition of Leaves of Grass, one I'd found tucked in a small antique bookstore 3 towns over, the same poem we used to read together when he was still a boy, sprawled out on our faded living room carpet, asking me what barbaric yop meant with that spark of curiosity I once adored. I wrapped it in brown craft paper and tied it with navy ribbon understated. Personal, sincere. When it was his turn to open gifts, the room quieted politely. Melissa handed him my package without much ceremony, and I watched as Andrew tore the paper without glancing at the note tucked inside. His eyes paused briefly on the title, and for a moment, I thought I saw recognition. A flicker of the boy I once knew, but then Melissa rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, "Another old thing for the shelf." Her voice was quiet, but not so quiet that the people nearest us didn't hear. A couple of polite chuckles circled the table. Andrew laughed not loudly, but the kind of dismissive, strained laugh that felt colder than silence. He held the book up for everyone to see and said with a half smile, "Honestly, Mom, the best gift you could give me would be to just leave my life." It landed like a slap. One sentence, spoken between a sip of wine and a bite of filet mignon. The room stilled. 1 or 2 guests chuckled, unsure whether it was a joke. Melissa gave a tight-lipped smile and raised her glass like it was all in good humor. But I saw the way Sophie, my sweet granddaughter, froze beside her phone, her eyes flickering toward me with confusion and sadness. I felt it too, the burn in my chest, the tremble that tried to rise up my throat, but I did not let it. I smiled faintly, the kind of practiced smile I'd learned after decades of holding back tears in public. And I nodded once. "Thank you for dinner," I said softly, placing my napkin beside my untouched plate, smoothing the hem of my skirt. I rose without a fuss. No dramatic gasp, no confrontation, no loud exit, just the sound of my heels against tile and the whisper of fabric as I slipped through the hallway and toward the guest room. The door closed behind me with a gentle click. I stood for a long time in the stillness, hands resting lightly on the suitcase I hadn't yet unpacked. Inside the drawer was the watch my late husband used to wear, Bram's old Omega, scratched and softened by time, and beside it, the envelope I had tucked in just in case. I had written Sophie's name on the front, in my neat librarian's cursive, "I love you. Call me if you ever need me." That was all. No bitterness, no explanations. The moonlight poured in through the tall windows, casting quiet shadows across the white walls. I sat down at the edge of the bed and looked around the guest room. Pristine, decorated like a showroom. No personal touches, no family photos. Just sterile elegance and cold air conditioning. A far cry from the warm clutter of the home where I had once raised Andrew, where picture books had lived on every surface and muddy sneakers left trails through the hallway, where Bram and I had read him stories by firelight, and later stayed up late comforting him after teenage heartbreaks. And now, he wanted me gone. He said it so casually, like he was ordering a different wine. I stood up slowly, moving like someone decades older than 70, and began to pack. I didn't fold things. I didn't fuss over arrangements. I just placed what mattered into the small navy suitcase. My documents, Bram's watch, the letter for Sophie, and the vintage book, the one gift rejected in front of strangers. I took it back not out of spite, but because it belonged with someone who understood its worth. I zipped the suitcase, buttoned my coat, and stood in the doorway one last time. I looked back at the guest room, not a home, just a temporary shelter that had already stopped welcoming me. I turned off the light. As I stepped outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of gardenias and engine oil. The taxi arrived right on time, a silent silver sedan with a kind driver who didn't ask questions when I said I was going to the train station. He simply helped me with my bag and played soft jazz as we rolled through the quiet streets. I didn't cry, not once. The tears had been spent years ago, in moments much smaller than this forgotten birthdays, rushed phone calls, the slow erosion of kindness. At the station, I bought a one-way ticket to the coast. The woman behind the counter smiled as she handed me the printed slip. "Long trip ahead?" she asked kindly. "Just far enough," I replied. As I waited on the platform, I thought about how Andrew used to hold my hand tightly when we rode trains together. He loved the rhythm of it, the sway and clatter, the blur of trees. He used to fall asleep with his head on my shoulder. I wondered, briefly, when that little boy disappeared, and whether the man who took his place would ever remember her. The train arrived. I stepped aboard with a heart not broken, but rearranged, like furniture in a familiar room that no longer felt the same. I found a window seat, placed the suitcase at my feet, and leaned back as the engine roared to life. The city blurred behind me, lights fading into a stretch of night that felt endless but somehow calm. I didn't know exactly what waited for me in that small coastal town, but I knew Clara would be there. I knew the air would smell of salt and fir trees, and for the first time in years, I knew I would have space to breathe. The sky was still dark when the train pulled into the coastal station. The air had that salty dampness particular to seaside towns, a mixture of fog and seaweed that clung gently to my coat as I stepped down from the platform. There was no welcoming committee, no warm hugs or familiar faces, just the quiet promise of something new, or perhaps something quieter than what I had left behind. Clara had told me she would leave the back gate open. "Don't knock," she had said when we spoke a few weeks prior about possibly visiting. "Just come in. My place is your place." At the time, it was a courtesy. Now, it felt like an invitation from fate itself. The cab dropped me off in front of a narrow gravel path. The cottage sat at the edge of a dune, its porch light casting a warm yellow glow through the early morning mist. I rolled my suitcase along the stones, wincing slightly at the way the wheels crunched too loudly in the stillness. When I opened the gate, it gave a soft creak, but true to her word, the door was unlocked. The scent of cinnamon and old wood drifted out to greet me. I stepped inside, careful not to wake anyone, but the moment I closed the door, I heard a soft voice from the hallway. "You made it," Clara whispered, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her gray hair messy with sleep but her eyes wide with concern. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why I'd shown up without warning. She simply led me to the guest room, a small, cozy space with a handmade quilt folded at the end of the bed and a steaming mug of herbal tea waiting on the nightstand. "Get some sleep," she said gently. "We'll talk in the morning." And I did. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I slept without waking in the middle of the night to stare at a ceiling I no longer recognized. Morning came with birdsong and the sound of the ocean not far off. I sat at the kitchen table with Clara, cradling a second cup of tea while she chopped fruit for breakfast. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was comforting. The kind that can only exist between two people who have known pain and lived to keep walking anyway. "He said he wanted me gone," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. So I left. Clara looked up from the cutting board and met my eyes with that warm steadiness she'd always had. the kind that anchored you when everything else was falling apart. "Helen," she said quietly, "you did the brave thing. You chose yourself." The next few days passed gently, like waves lapping at the shore. I unpacked slowly, not just the clothes in my suitcase, but also the weight I'd been carrying on my shoulders for far too long. I went for long walks along the beach, the sand cool beneath my feet, the wind tugging at the edges of my coat. I visited the little bookstore in town, where a teenager with green hair and a nose ring recommended me a novel about a woman who starts over in her 70s. I laughed softly at the irony and bought it anyway. I sat in Clara's garden reading for hours. Her cat curled beside me, the scent of rosemary and lavender in the air. I cooked dinner twice that week, something I hadn't done in months, and remembered the way it felt to cook for love rather than obligation. In the evenings, Clara and I would talk. Not always about Andrew, but sometimes. She knew the outlines of our story, the high-achieving son, the polished daughter-in-law, the slowly growing distance that had become a canyon I could no longer cross. "It's not just what he said," I told her one night as we sat by the fire, sipping cocoa. "It's that he meant it. And he didn't take it back." Clara nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around her mug. "People don't always understand the power of words," she murmured. "But you did. You heard him. And you believed him. That's strength, Helen. That's not weakness." On the third morning, I walked to the little cafe near the harbor and sat alone with a blueberry scone and a cup of black coffee. I pulled out my journal, the one I'd started years ago, but never quite filled, and began to write. Not just about the dinner or the insult, but about the years that came before it. The quiet sacrifices. The phone calls that grew shorter. The birthdays forgotten, then replaced with wire transfers and terse thank you texts. The loneliness that crept in gradually, like moss on a stone. I wrote until my hand ached, and then I wrote some more. That afternoon, I called a locksmith and changed the passcode on my old storage unit back in the city. I called the post office and rerouted all future mail to Clara's address. And then I sat down and wrote a letter to Sophie. A longer one. Not just a note of love, but an explanation gentle and age-appropriate of why I had left without saying goodbye. I told her it wasn't her fault, that I loved her with every beat of my heart. That sometimes adults make painful decisions to protect what's left of their peace. I told her I was okay, that I was safe, and that I would always be there if she ever needed me, even if I wasn't in the same house or the same city. Before I sealed the envelope, I tucked inside a small photograph. The two of us in the garden when she was maybe 6 or 7, covered in dirt, grinning from ear to ear as we held up the crooked carrots we'd pulled from the ground. I remember that day so clearly, the warmth of the sun, the smell of soil, the joy of watching something grow. It was the memory I wanted her to carry, not the silence that came after. That night, I stood on Clara's porch, watching the sun dip into the ocean, a golden trail stretching across the waves like a path I could walk if only I had the courage. But I didn't need to walk that far. I was already exactly where I needed to be. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't waiting for a phone call or bracing for disappointment. I was simply present with the sea, the stars, and the whisper of a new beginning. The rhythm of the sea became my metronome. Each morning, I would wake to the gentle crash of waves in the distance, as if the ocean itself were whispering a reminder that life moves forward, even when our hearts stay behind. Clara's little cottage, with its mismatched curtains and creaking floorboards, had a heartbeat of its own. There was something sacred in its imperfections, the chipped teacup she insisted on using every morning, the photo frame slightly crooked on the hallway wall, the way the screen door always slammed too hard if you didn't catch it just right. It felt like a place that had been lived in, not curated. A place where people were allowed to exist, with their wounds showing. I found myself drawn more and more to the garden out back, a modest stretch of land, fenced with old driftwood and overgrown with rosemary, daisies, and a stubborn patch of mint that refused to be tamed. I'd spend hours there with my hands in the soil, the sun warming my shoulders, and the earth reminding me that healing often begins below the surface. I hadn't gardened in years, not since Bram's death. Back then, it felt too quiet, too empty, without his humming nearby, or the way he always pretended not to notice the earthworms. But now, that same silence felt full, not of loneliness, but of potential. Clara watched me one afternoon as I knelt beside the rosemary bush, dirt streaked across my cheek, a faint smile on my lips. "You look alive again," she said gently, setting a pitcher of lemonade on the patio table. I nodded, wiping my hands on my jeans. "I think I forgot how to breathe," I admitted. Back there, in the city, in that house, everything felt so tight, like I was shrinking to fit into someone else's story. Clara sat beside me, her hands folded over her knees. "Well, you're writing a new one now, and this time, it's yours." In the afternoons, I wandered the town. Lincoln Haven was the kind of place where people still waved to strangers and dogs roamed without leashes. I visited the library, a small, sunlit space run by a woman named Joanne, who wore glasses on a chain and remembered everyone's reading preferences. She smiled when I introduced myself and said, "I think we could use someone like you around here." I blushed, unsure of what she meant, until she handed me a clipboard with volunteer forms and added, "We're hosting a literacy program next month. Care to help?" I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. It had been years since I stood in front of a classroom or guided a child through their first chapter book, but the idea sparked something inside me, not nostalgia, but purpose. Clara and I established a routine. Mornings in the garden, afternoons around town, evenings with tea and conversation or sometimes comfortable silence. We started playing Scrabble again, like we used to in college, and I marveled at how easily we slipped back into old rhythms. We laughed, we teased, we remembered. She told me about her late husband, her daughters who lived in different states, the grandchild she only saw on holidays. I told her about Andrew, not the man he had become, but the boy he once was. I spoke of his Lego castles and science fair volcanoes, the way he used to cry when he couldn't solve a math problem but always insisted on trying again. "He was such a kind child," I said one night, stirring honey into my tea. "I don't know when that changed." Clara looked at me with something between sorrow and understanding. "Maybe it didn't change," she said softly. "Maybe it just got buried." Those words stayed with me. They echoed as I walked the beach in the early morning fog, as I listened to the gulls cry overhead, as I watched children chase waves and mothers call after them. Maybe the kindness was still there, hidden beneath ambition, stress, and the cold polish of success. Or maybe I was just trying to make sense of something that had no clean explanation. But for the first time, I wasn't obsessing over it. I was letting the question exist without needing an answer. One afternoon, while browsing the small craft shop near the pier, I came across a notebook bound in deep green leather, its pages thick and creamy. Without thinking, I bought it. That evening, I opened it at the kitchen table and began writing letters I would never send. One to Andrew, one to Melissa, even one to myself. I wrote about grief, about silence, about the strange ache of becoming invisible to someone you raised. I wrote about freedom, about choosing solitude not as an escape but as a reclamation. And then I wrote a letter to Bram. I told him everything, the dinner, the insult, the walkout. I told him I missed the way he used to make me laugh when the world felt heavy. I told him I hoped he would have been proud of me for walking away, for choosing peace over proximity. I ended the letter by saying, "I still feel you in the quiet." Days passed, then a week, and slowly the sharpness of Andrew's words dulled. The sting was still there, of course, but it no longer felt like it defined me. I was more than that moment, more than someone's forgotten mother. I was Helen Warren, 70 years old, retired librarian, widow, gardener, friend, woman, rebuilding herself without apology. I looked in the mirror one morning and saw the silver streaks in my hair, not as symbols of fading, but as proof that I had endured, that I was still here, still breathing. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky looked like frosted glass, and the breeze carried the faint scent of salt and chimney smoke. I had just finished folding laundry when I noticed the corner of an old envelope sticking out from between the pages of my notebook. Not the green leather one I wrote my letters in, but the brown spiral-bound ledger I had kept for decades, the one Bram and I used to track every household expense and investment since the year we got married. I sat down at the table, pulled the ledger close, and for the first time in a long while, I opened it not with nostalgia, but with intent. Page after page of neatly recorded entries stared back at me. At first, it was all simple. Grocery bills, electric payments, the cost of fixing a leaky roof, or saving for Sophie's school trip to Washington, D.C. Then, the entries shifted larger numbers, more risks. I traced my fingers along the inked lines that documented a lifetime of giving. $40,000 for Andrew's first failed startup, $35,000 to cover the down payment on their second condo, $22,000 in quiet tuition payments when Melissa decided to return to school. At the time, I hadn't hesitated. I told myself I was helping my family, easing their burdens, investing in their future. But sitting there now, in Clara's quiet cottage, with only the sound of wind brushing against the windows, those same numbers told a different story, one of invisible sacrifice, silent assumptions, and generosity that had become expectation. I remember the first time Andrew asked me for money. He was in his late 20s, wide-eyed and ambitious, full of energy and new ideas. He said he just needed a little help to get started. I didn't blink. I transferred $20,000 from my personal savings that very week. He promised he'd pay it back. With interest. He never did, and I never asked. The second time came when he wanted to launch a delivery service app. He was sure it would change the market. I gave him another $35,000. This time, there was no talk of repayment. Just a thank you text with a thumbs-up emoji. I laughed it off. Bram would have too. He always said, "If you have it, share it, but share wisely." Somewhere along the way, I forgot the second half of that sentence. Then came the real estate ventures. Andrew wanted to invest early in a new condominium project. He and Melissa were planning to move into a more upscale neighborhood, one closer to Sophie's school and better aligned with their social circles, as Melissa put it. I offered to help with the down payment, but when the paperwork arrived, my name wasn't anywhere. I had paid over half, yet nothing in writing reflected that. I let it go. After all, it was for my family. Wasn't that the point? Even Melissa's boutique, the high-end clothing store she opened in the middle of the pandemic, had my fingerprints on it. She came to me one Sunday afternoon, her voice trembling just enough to signal distress. She said there had been delays, unexpected shipping costs, issues with rent. I wrote a check for $25,000 that night. She didn't look me in the eye when she thanked me. And now, looking back, I'm not even sure she said thank you at all. Clara found me still sitting at the table later that afternoon, the ledger open, my teacup gone cold beside me. She didn't interrupt. She simply sat across from me and waited. I looked up slowly, unsure of how to say what I had come to realize. "I've given away so much," I whispered. "Not just money, but time, energy, forgiveness, and I never once asked myself if they deserved it." Clara nodded gently. "You gave because that's who you are, Helen. But maybe it's time to give to yourself." That night, I lay awake, Bram's watch ticking quietly on the nightstand beside me. I thought about legacy Not just the kind that gets carved into stone or printed on checks, but the kind that lives in memory, in dignity, in the stories people tell long after we're gone. What kind of legacy was I leaving if I kept rewarding carelessness? What message was I sending to Sophie if I continued to fund silence and distance? The next morning, I made a call to a local attorney's office in town. His name was Gregory Hale, mid-40s, well-spoken, with an office that smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. I told him I needed to revise my will. He asked who I wanted to name as my primary beneficiary. No one, I said firmly. Not in the traditional sense. I pulled out the folder I had prepared the night before, a detailed breakdown of what I owned, where it was held, and how I wanted it used. I told him I wanted to establish a scholarship fund, one that would support young women pursuing degrees in education, library sciences, or social work. The fund would be named after Bram, not me. It would also support literacy programs in underserved communities, and a portion would be allocated to help elderly women transition into independent living after divorce or widowhood. I want it to go where it can grow, I said, where it can plant roots, not just disappear. Gregory blinked a few times, then gave a slow, respectful nod. And your son? He asked carefully. I paused, the question expected but still difficult. He'll be notified of the change, I said quietly. But no, I won't be leaving him anything. Gregory hesitated, then added, Would you like to include a letter? Something explaining your decision? I shook my head. If he ever truly wonders, he can look at the years behind us. The record is there. It took 2 hours to complete the legal paperwork. When I signed my name at the bottom of the final page, something uncurled inside me. A tension I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years eased like the loosening of a too tight knot. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about alignment. I had spent most of my life giving from instinct. Now, I was giving with purpose. Clara insisted we go out for lunch afterward. She ordered us both a glass of wine and raised hers in a quiet toast. To choosing wisely, she said. I smiled and raised mine in return. To remembering our own worth. Back at the cottage, I sat by the window, watching the tide roll in. The sun was beginning to dip behind the waves, casting streaks of orange and mauve across the sky. I held the revised will in my lap, the pages thick and official beneath my fingertips. I thought of Andrew, of all the times he had asked, and all the times I had said yes. I thought of how he hadn't asked how I was doing in over 3 years, of how Melissa referred to me as your mom, like I was a staff member instead of family. And then I thought of Sophie, her laughter, her curiosity, the way she used to sneak into my bed on Sunday mornings to ask for pancakes and poetry. Maybe someday, Sophie would understand. Maybe she already did. Either way, I wasn't doing this for applause. I wasn't doing it to make a statement. I was doing it because, for the first time in my life, I was asking myself the question I had always asked of others: do they deserve this? And finally, I was brave enough to answer it. It was late afternoon, the kind of golden hour where the shadows stretched long across Clara's kitchen floor and the light filtered in like honey through the lace curtains. I was slicing apples for a pie when the phone rang, the old landline Clara still insisted on keeping. She glanced at the caller ID, her brow furrowing slightly. "It's Sophie," she said, holding the receiver out toward me. My heart paused mid-beat. It had been nearly a month since I left, and this was the first call from anyone in my old life that didn't come with a bank logo or a signature line. I took the phone with both hands, grounding myself. "Hello?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. There was a pause, then a soft, breathy, "Grandma?" And just like that, the wall I had built in my chest cracked. "Hi, sweetheart," I said gently, lowering myself into the chair. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. I could hear her breathing, shallow and shaky. Then finally, "Why didn't you say goodbye?" Her voice broke on the last word, and I closed my eyes, swallowing the ache that threatened to rise. Because, I whispered, your father asked me to leave, and I wanted to honor that without making a scene. She was quiet again, then, almost inaudibly, he didn't mean it. I let the silence stretch between us, soft and solemn. Maybe not, I said, but he said it. And sometimes, Sophie, words have a weight we don't get to take back. She sniffled. He's been weird, angry, quiet. Mom, too. It's like everyone's pretending everything's fine, but I know it's not. I imagined the house, the long dining table, the perfectly curated decor, now hollowed out by the absence of the one person who had once filled it with warmth. Do you miss me? I asked softly. She didn't hesitate. Every day, I closed my eyes, biting the inside of my cheek. I left a note for you, I said. In the drawer by the guest bed. Did you find it? No, she said quickly. I haven't been allowed in there since you left. That didn't surprise me. Well, I continued, I want you to know that I'm okay. I'm safe. And I'm always just a phone call away. We talked for another hour about her school, her music, the cat next door she had secretly started feeding. She told me about how Melissa had started locking the pantry at night and how Andrew had been snapping more than usual. They say it's stress, she mumbled. But I think it's guilt. I didn't respond. I just listened, letting her unload the things she couldn't say at home. Before we hung up, she asked if she could visit. Just for a weekend. Just to see you. I told her that Clara and I would love that. Tell your father I invited you. I added, but only if he's comfortable with it. I don't want to put you in the middle. Her voice was firm, decisive. I'm already in the middle. I'd rather be somewhere that feels like home. The next weekend, she arrived with a small overnight bag and a face that looked older than 16. I met her at the local station, and the moment she saw me, she dropped her bag and threw her arms around my waist. We stood there like that for a long while, unmoving, letting the stillness speak. When we pulled apart, her eyes were glassy but determined. You look happy, she said. I smiled. I think I am. We spent the weekend baking, walking the beach, and talking late into the night. She asked questions, not accusatory, just curious. Did you always feel unappreciated? When did you know it was time to leave? Are you scared of being alone? I answered each one honestly, never bitterly. I told her that love without respect is like sunlight without warmth. It might light the way, but it doesn't help anything grow. She wrote that down in her journal. That Saturday night, as we sat on the porch watching the tide roll in, she said, Dad's been going through your things. I turned to look at her. What things? Your paperwork, the drawers in your old study. He's been calling banks, talking to lawyers. I think he's trying to figure out what you left behind. I exhaled slowly, unsurprised. And what did he find? She shrugged. Not much. Just a bunch of envelopes you marked "Do Not Touch" and some donation records. He seemed frustrated, like he thought there would be more. I didn't say what I was thinking, that Andrew had always measured value in terms of what could be inherited, controlled, or leveraged. That he had confused presence with permanence and generosity with obligation. That for the first time in his life, the bank of motherly love had quietly closed its doors. The day Sophie left, she hugged me twice as long as when she arrived. I wish I could stay longer, she whispered. I feel more myself here. I kissed her forehead and said, that means you're carrying this place inside you. You can come back anytime. Later that week, I received a voicemail from Andrew. His voice was flat, but I could hear the strain beneath it. Mom, I didn't expect you to actually leave. I was upset, stressed. You know how work gets. Melissa's under a lot of pressure, and I didn't mean what I said. A long pause. Then, Sophie came back different. She kept saying you're happy, that you've changed. I don't know what that means, but I just wanted to say, I guess I miss you. I didn't call back. Not because I didn't care. Not because I wanted to hurt him. But because I needed him to sit in the same silence he had handed me at that dinner table, the one full of laughter that wasn't mine. I needed him to realize that not all doors stay unlocked. That love, when taken for granted long enough, quietly packs a suitcase and slips away before dawn. I didn't erase the message. I saved it, tucked away like a pressed flower between pages. A reminder that regret is its own kind of inheritance, one not written into wills or bank statements, but etched into the spaces left behind. It was early September, the kind of morning when the air still held a trace of summer warmth, but the wind had already begun to speak in autumn's voice. Clara was out tending to the lavender bushes behind the cottage when I heard the knock. It was not timid, nor forceful, just a steady rhythm against the front door, like someone who wasn't sure if they had the right house but had come too far to turn away. I opened it expecting a delivery, maybe a neighbor. But instead, there he was. Andrew stood on the porch, in a navy blazer over a pale gray shirt. His hair more disheveled than I remembered. His jaw tense in that way Bram's used to be when he didn't sleep. His eyes flicked over me quickly, like he wasn't prepared to see me so plainly, apron still tied at the waist, flour on my hands from kneading bread not 10 minutes earlier. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, then finally said, "Hi, Mom." It took me a moment to speak. "Andrew," I said calmly, "I wasn't expecting you." He shifted on his feet, the gravel crunching beneath his expensive loafers. "Yeah, I wasn't expecting to come either." I nodded once and stepped aside. "You're here now." He hesitated a second longer, then stepped into the small cottage, eyes scanning the living room like it was unfamiliar terrain. "This is where you've been," he said. Not a question, just an observation. "Yes," I replied. "It's peaceful here." He didn't sit until I gestured toward the armchair near the window. I returned to the kitchen, washed my hands, and brought us 2 mugs of tea, the same chamomile I'd made him when he was 10 and couldn't sleep before a spelling bee. When I set the mug in front of him, he looked surprised. "You remembered," he murmured. I simply said, "I never stopped." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of Clara's radio, drifting in from the backyard, and the tick of the old clock above the fireplace. Finally, Andrew cleared his throat. "I've been thinking a lot. Since Sophie visited. Since you left." I nodded slightly. "And?" He exhaled through his nose, looked down at the steam rising from his mug. "I didn't mean what I said that night. Not really." I was frustrated. Work had been tense. Melissa was pressuring me about some decisions. I was caught in the middle. I listened, not interrupting, watching his face as he spoke. He looked older than 44. Not in a physical way, he still had the same strong jaw, the same furrowed brow, but in the way people look when they've started to carry consequences. "I told myself you'd come back," he continued. "That you just needed a break. But then the bank called, and the house was empty. And Sophie said you seemed different." I let the words hang in the air. "I am different," I said softly. "I had to be." His eyes finally met mine. "But why didn't you tell me? Why not confront me? Or yell? Or something?" I tilted my head slightly. "Would it have changed anything? Would you have heard me then? Or would you have chalked it up to emotional overreaction, like you used to when I'd voice concern?" He flinched. "That's not fair, isn't it?" I asked gently. He rubbed his hands together, leaning forward. I always thought you'd be there. That no matter what happened, you'd be Mom." I smiled sadly. "I am still your mother, Andrew, but I'm also Helen. A woman. A person. And I got tired of being invisible." Oh, there was a pause. Then a quiet, almost broken whisper. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I know, I said. But you did. He looked around the room again, the crocheted throw on the couch, the books stacked beside the fireplace, the vase of dried lavender on the windowsill. You built something here, he said, more to himself than to me. Yes, I replied, and I did it without permission or applause. He nodded slowly. I saw the changes. The will, the scholarship, the accounts. And? I asked. He looked down. I guess I assumed I'd be part of that I'd inherit something. You did, I said. You inherited years of unwavering support, financial, emotional, spiritual. You just didn't recognize it as inheritance because it didn't come with paperwork. He didn't argue. He just stared into his tea like it might tell him something he couldn't find on his own. Is it too late? He asked quietly. To fix things? I considered that carefully. To fix the past? Yes. Some things once done can't be undone. But to rebuild something new? That depends. On what? On whether you're ready to see me as more than a resource, as more than a symbol of security or sacrifice. On whether you're willing to be my son, not by obligation, but by choice. He nodded slowly. I want that, he said. I do. I didn't smile. Not because I didn't believe him, but because I knew that change doesn't live in declarations. It lives in the days after, in the follow-through. We'll see, I said gently. Time will tell. We didn't hug when he left. There were no tears, no promises. Just a long, quiet look between us on the porch. The kind that acknowledged pain and history without needing to rehash it all. He said thank you. I nodded. And then he walked back to his car, the engine humming to life as the wind picked up off the coast. After he drove away, Clara came back inside, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. How was it? She asked softly. I took a deep breath, then exhaled. Honest, I said, and unfinished. She poured us each a glass of water and sat beside me. That's something, she said. Most reunions are just reruns. I looked out the window at the ocean in the distance, thinking of all the things still unsaid and all the things better left that way. Sometimes, beginnings come disguised as endings. Sometimes, people return not for forgiveness, but to understand what they lost. And sometimes, just sometimes, showing up is the start of something real. I never thought of myself as a woman who would start over at 70. Reinventing oneself always sounded like something 20-somethings did in big cities with roommates and part-time jobs in coffee shops. But here I was, 70 years old, waking up each day in a small coastal town, folding my laundry into drawers that weren't mine a year ago, and feeling, for the first time in a long while, a quiet sense of belonging not to a place or to a role, but to myself. My days took on a rhythm that was neither rushed nor rigid. Mornings began with tea and the newspaper, sometimes shared with Clara, sometimes alone on the porch as I listened to the waves stretching their arms toward the shore. Mid-mornings were for the library board meetings or volunteer sessions with the local literacy group. I worked with children who were shy at first, but bloomed under the sound of their own voices reading aloud. I tutored a teenager who reminded me of Sophie, except he wore mismatched socks and always had ink smudged on his fingers. He wrote poetry in secret and blushed when I told him his metaphors were surprisingly mature. No one's ever said that before, he whispered once. Well, I replied, maybe no one ever listened close enough. Afternoons were for errands, for books, for letters. I started corresponding with a woman in Vermont I'd met online through a gardening forum. We traded notes about soil, life, and the strange feeling of being underestimated simply because our hair had turned silver. Some evenings, Clara and I went to the town hall for local concerts. Other nights, I stayed home, cooked simple meals, and ate with music playing softly from the radio. the kind Bram and I used to dance to in our kitchen when no one was watching. I saw Sophie almost every month. Sometimes she came alone, other times with a friend. We made blueberry pancakes, painted shells, and talked about everything from feminism to physics. She confided in me about school, about feeling like she didn't quite fit in at home anymore. "They're always so tense," she said once. "Like they're waiting for the other shoe to drop, but they don't even remember who threw the first one." I chuckled, then hugged her tight. "You're wiser than most grown-ups I know," I told her. "That's not always easy, but it's always worth it." Andrew's visits were rare and brief. He came by twice in 3 months. The first time, he brought a pie he didn't bake and apologies he still didn't know how to phrase. The second time, he sat on the porch with me in silence for nearly an hour. No speeches, no explanations. Just the two of us, watching the ocean move like it had done for centuries before either of us existed. I didn't ask for more. He didn't offer it. That was enough for now. I started writing again, not just letters or journal entries, but essays, reflections, pieces of a life reassembled one paragraph at a time. I submitted a piece to a small literary magazine about the invisible labor of motherhood and the quiet power of walking away. They published it, and I received a dozen letters from women who said they saw themselves in every word. One of them wrote, "You gave me permission to breathe." I pinned that one on the bulletin board above my desk. One day, while walking back from the market, I passed by the community center and saw a flyer pinned to the corkboard. "Call for speakers. Life after retirement. Finding purpose at any age." I stared at it for a full minute, heart pounding in that familiar mix of fear and curiosity. That night, I emailed the coordinator. A month later, I stood in front of 30 people, sharing my story, not the pain or the betrayal, but the rebuilding, the choosing, the reclaiming. When I finished, the room was silent for a beat, and then someone clapped. Then another. And soon, the room was filled with soft, steady applause. Not for drama, not for pity, but for truth. There was no big celebration, no medals. Just a cup of warm tea afterward, and a message from Sophie that said, "I'm proud of you." That meant more than anything. I planted a garden in Clara's backyard: tomatoes, basil, lavender, and snapdragons. Every morning, I walked barefoot across the grass to water them. Sometimes I spoke to them, not because I thought they'd grow faster, but because it felt good to be heard, even by things with roots. I had always been someone who blended into the background, who offered help quietly, who loved without needing a spotlight. But here, now, I was learning that living on your terms doesn't require rebellion. It requires consistency, boundaries, grace. It means choosing what you plant, what you water, and what you let die. There were still hard days. Days when I missed Bram with a dull ache that no letter could ease. Days when I thought of the little boy Andrew once was, all questions and hugs, and wondered if I could have done something differently. Days when I saw an old family photo and had to look away before the tears rose. But they were only days, not decades, not lifetimes, just passing clouds in a sky that was mostly, finally, clear. One evening, Clara brought home a bottle of red wine and insisted we toast to "What's next?" I smiled and lifted my glass. "To living on purpose," I said. She nodded, and with peace. As I stood on the porch that night, wind brushing against my face, I realized I didn't need closure from anyone. Not Andrew, not Melissa, not the version of myself who spent so many years waiting for gratitude that never came. What I needed, and what I had finally claimed, was space. Space to think, to feel, to grow, to rest. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew it would be mine. And that was more than enough. There was a time when I believed being a good mother meant saying yes. Yes to sacrifice, yes to silence, Yes to setting aside your own needs for the sake of those you love. But as the years wore on, I learned something quietly, painfully, and eventually, peacefully, that love without boundaries becomes expectation. And when we give endlessly without recognition, we don't just lose energy, we lose visibility. We fade into the background of our own stories. Walking away wasn't easy. Choosing peace over proximity wasn't the louder path, it was the lonelier one, but it was also the truest. And in that stillness, in the space where I let go of the roles others had assigned me, I found someone I hadn't heard from in years: myself. To anyone listening, especially the women in their 50s, 60s, or 70s, I want to tell you this: it is never too late to choose yourself. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for expecting respect. And you are not less of a mother, wife, or daughter for deciding that your voice matters. Maybe your children have forgotten to call. Maybe you've been taken for granted by the very people you raised. Maybe you've spent your life holding everything together and now feel quietly undone. I see you. I was you. And I promise there is still more ahead than behind. There is still breath, still purpose, still joy that doesn't depend on anyone's approval. You don't need to disappear to find yourself. But you do need space, stillness, and the courage to ask, what do I want now? And then listen. If this story touched your heart, made you reflect, or gave you a moment of stillness, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we share stories that speak not just to the pain, but to the healing, to the strength it takes to say enough, and the grace it takes to keep going anyway. Leave a comment if you've ever felt invisible, or if you've recently reclaimed your voice. You are not alone. We are building a community of quiet strength. And if you think someone you love needs to hear this story, share it with them. Sometimes, a story is more than just a story. Sometimes, it's a mirror.